Dear students, dear guests, welcome to the sessions on territory. This spring, which almost arrived, we are addressing the notion of materials, urbanism as material accumulation. This series, this program is co-curated and organized between the two schools, exceptional arrangement, ETH Zurich Department of Architecture and Harvard Graduate School of Design. I would like to thank my co-curators, Assistant Professor at the GSD, Dr. Charlotte Malterre-Barthes, and Hans Hortig, Doctorate Candidate at the ETH. Thank you for a great collaboration. And a special welcome once again to the GSD students. And also a warm welcome to our speaker tonight, Professor Joshua Comaroff, joining from Singapore, and Faiq Mari, who joins as respondent. They will be introduced in a moment. So you can already see that we are at least on 3 continents, if not more, a very special constellation indeed. Also in at least 3 time zones, I think. So a very interesting advantage of the Zoom experience. I would like to ask perhaps our students, at least in the introduction, to turn off their cameras, those of you who want just to have that moment of kind of embodied interaction. And after that, we can kind of go back to our private space once again. And I would kindly ask Hans also to share the screen right now. So I will say a few words on the background of this lecture series. The question that concerns us already since a few years in this program is the future of urbanism. Almost actually more than 4 years ago, we started sessions on territory together with Professor Marc Angelil with the question, if urbanism as discipline should keep its relevance in the future as part of architects' education and practice, what should be its main concerns and main characteristics? Under urbanism, we understood a wider range of fields and practices from the core urban and landscape design to urban and territorial research to urban studies, and to a range of spatial practices, including activism and arts. We also understand urbanism in an extended sense as a broadening of our perspective from cities to wider territories and even to planet as a whole. I don't see actually the poster. Does everybody see the image? Yes. This is our current lecture series. Thank you. So now I will take you back through those previous sessions very briefly that we had. So a brief look back in the fall of 2017, you can change your slide. We started the sessions on territory under the theme Urbanism Beyond Neoliberalism. And the goal was to consider urbanism and urban design in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the era of strengthening of neoliberal ideas and ideologies. And back then we debated who has the power to influence and shape urban environments and what is the role of architects and urbanists in these new constellations. Next one. A semester later, we put a spotlight on the notion of an urban project, on both formidable and surprising and alternative spatial realities and design projects that have emerged or have been created under these constellations. Further, in the fall of 2018, we relaunched the sessions in relation to the notions of Anthropocene and ecology. Thank you, Hans. To consider how the agencies of urban and territorial design will be influenced by the environmental forces and crisis and the urgency of socio-ecological transition. Once again, this is the series we ran for the entire year. And finally, last year, 1 year ago, in the spring of 2019, we debated urbanism and urban design in relation to technology. How the all-pervasive technologies, machines, and tools, how the all-pervasive digitalization impact the design field. And we did so beyond the kind of mere technological solutionism and beyond the technofix. So with the kind of explicit critical stance toward those points of view. And today we are delighted to be back in the 6th iteration of the sessions on territory to open the discussion on the future of urbanism in relation to materials, material flows, and material accumulations. In the 5 events that you will see this spring with our guests, Joshua Comaroff, Carola Heim, Sarah Nichols, Jane May Hutton, and Anna Tsing, and many others, we will discuss material cultures of architecture and urbanism and spatial and political practices of material use, from the territories of resource extraction to the construction sites and to the spaces of everyday life. How can we reimagine these material cultures and practices and spaces through the agency of design? So interesting, and those topics have been with us since a number of years. It's kind of feels being very much at home in these questions, and it is my honor to open this discussion with the guests, and especially my co-curator Charlotte Malterre-Barthes, who will share with you a few more of those ideas on material accumulation.
Thank you, Milica. Yeah, so the session in territory are, as Milica mentioned, a kind of exceptional endeavor for the fact that it actually tries to make 2 institutions actually work together, which doesn't always come easy, but somehow we managed. So the sessions on territory are integrated in a seminar that I currently teach at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. It's interested in establishing a critical methodology and a research design approach on commodity chains of materials and their relation to the built environment. I want to share a trailer. 1 second, sorry, of course, this is not working as one wants. 1 second. Apologies. I would quote Marc Angelil, who says technology never works. So you should see a black screen, is that correct? Yes. So, and here, what you see here, I don't think you're getting any sound, which is correct. Is the trailer of that class. So the session on territory are, as I said, integrated in a class called Material World. And in this class, we pursue an investigation around the political economy of construction materials in order to unearth hidden economic, political, and social realities that are typically considered to be beyond the purview of architecture and design discipline. So we wish to bridge the distance between sites of production and consumption. And then I would say that this work is grounded in the premise that there is no such thing as neutrality of design, and that the expansionist global enterprise of extraction spans across all scales, and that architecture is but one of these scales. So this class aims to connect these together by unpacking complexity of an industry and its spatial counterpart. So with my students at the GSD, we're currently investigating 4 materials: concrete, steel, brick, and wood. Research that will culminate and result in a video. So these students are uncovering the politics of displaced mass involved in concrete construction, the fallacy of sustainable discourse of the brick industry, the waste and depletion of resources for tropical timber, and the material journey of iron ore from mine to buildings. All of these are touching upon several possible hidden agendas, or maybe not so hidden, which I'm sure will actually emerge in our conversation in this lecture series. pointing at the care and the maintenance of the earth as one, or hinting at the accountability of designers, interrogating the design complexity of commodity chains, or questioning the human stewardship of resources to perhaps reposition design disciplines in a new ontology of material extraction, one that would challenge the production and the reproduction of nature, and so on and so forth. So these 5 lectures are integrated and part of that class and are instrumental in helping us construct a theoretical framework for our own research. So thank you, Milica, for this great collaboration.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure. And indeed, great that we could make it. Yes.
Then I will add
yes, Hans Hortig, and he has the honor not only tonight but this entire lecture series to introduce every one of our amazing speakers.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and to welcome the students and give a few sentences on the course itself. So we will have these 5 sessions, as it has been mentioned. We are expecting you to attend 4 out of these 5 in order to successfully pass the course, which we will always start at 4 and try to finish by 5:45. All the sessions will consist of the same format, so we will have a lecture of up to 45 minutes by invited guests, and then a conversation afterwards where we invite very much all the participants to participate, and also maybe use, if necessary, the chat function of Zoom for to ask questions.
I was going to make pancakes. I'll just make a post for now. Is it just this one?
I'm introducing the speakers. Joshua Comaroff is a designer and an academic. He studied at Amherst College and Harvard Graduate School of Design, taking degrees in the fields of architecture, literature, and landscape architecture. In 2009, In 2009, Joshua completed a PhD in cultural geography at the University of California, Los Angeles, writing on the subject of haunted landscapes and urban memory in Singapore. He has published writings about architecture, urbanism, religion, and politics with an Asian focus. In particularly, his research focused upon the effects of material and immaterial practices, such as faith, effect, and speculation in the experience of the city. His articles have been published in a number of journals, to mention a few: the Public Culture, Journal of Southeast Asian Studies, City, and the Harvard Design Magazine. Together with Ong Kyer Shing, he's the author of Horror in Architecture, and he's assistant professor in urban design in the urban design program at the Yale University, where he's not only teaching, but he also designed with his office lacquer the courtyard of the building. Today, as a respondent, we will have Faiq Mari. Faiq is an architect working in the field of architecture, architectural research, education, and design, with a focus on architects' potential as a tool of social and political investigation and action. Faiq's research largely focuses on 2 parallel tracks, on which studies, one which studies the spatiality of Zionist colonism in Palestine, and another one which studies Palestine, anti-colonial and socio-ecological struggle. He is currently a doctoral fellow at the Institute of History and Theory of Architecture, the GTA, at the ETH. Prior to joining the GTA, he practiced architecture and taught at Birzeit and Al-Quds University in Palestine. Faiq holds a bachelor degree in architectural engineering from Birzeit University, and a master's degree in architectural history and theory from the University of Michigan Ann Arbor, where he was a Fulbright scholar. With this introduction, I'm happy to welcome Joshua Comaroff and look forward to the presentation and the discussion today.
Great, thank you very much. Hans for that introduction. I'm just going to share my screen. Hopefully we won't have technical difficulties. Do we see my slides? Is that visible? Yes. Okay. Okay, well, before I start, I would just like to very warmly thank the organizers of this amazing series, Milica, Charlotte, and Hans, for inviting me to participate, and to Faiq for agreeing to join the conversation as a respondent. I look forward to our conversation after, and to everyone here who is listening today. Today, I want to try two things, neither of which I've actually fully attempted before. The first is a theorization of the island as a territorial form. While an enormous amount has been written about islands, they have not, to my knowledge, been given what we might call a satisfyingly general theory. And I'll argue shortly that this is because unknowability has long been and remains a kind of central conceptual association of the island. Second, I want to ask what the materiality of this elusive territorial form might be. Do islands necessarily need to be made of stuff? Must an island have weight? Must it have area? Must it even physically exist in order to be something real? That is something other than a metaphor or a figure of speech. Today's talk is a very brief summary of ongoing research that I'm doing, so I'll really only be introducing a set of propositions and research questions that I'm taking up at length elsewhere. But I am selecting these to offer a kind of a provocation, maybe a way of thinking about territory that moves beyond spatial concepts of bounded statehood that I believe are no longer particularly helpful and, to be accurate, were perhaps mythological all along. Islands are a recurring theme of my work. I live on one, Singapore, the so-called intelligent island, at least according to its own national branding. And I'm going to try to argue now that we all exist in them, but perhaps not in the way that we would expect. We move through them also, and we are positioned often within several at the same time. And by this, I do not mean some kind of rhetorical sleight of hand, speaking of islands metaphorically. I mean that we, all of us, from say specialist geographers to a general public, have in the most literal sense misrecognized the islands in our histories and those in our present, confusing them with a single most visually overt archetype. I believe that we have mistaken the geographical, territorial situation of the island, a kind of great and pervasive thing, for a patch of land, like we see here, usually ringed with sand, kind of floating in the sea. And however important these patches in the sea might be, and if we follow the news, they are clearly very important indeed still. But I'm going to argue that the island is emerging as the dominant territorial paradigm of the future. All states are now in the island business. What we see is a kind of fundamental shift from a territorial myth to a territorial reality in which states are continually constructing islands both within and beyond themselves. Some of these, like China's contested islands in Southeast Asia, conform to the convention of a barren platform in the water. Right? These are essentially the same as what we imagine in tropes extending back to, say, Robinson Crusoe. But very often the island is not this. I mean, very often it's not an object or a thing, although it may carry the force or the violence of one. And the island often resembles what Karl Marx called a concrete abstraction, a vagary or convention like law and money, assigned then to a special economic zone or a voting district or a county, for example, that has no material existence, no discrete ecology, no beach or no palm trees, but can nonetheless determine the routine or the quality of lives or the destruction of them. The highly visible and loudly bruited reclamation of China's islands or Singapore's absorption of Indonesia's Riau Islands into its own coastline often distracts us from the quiet re-territorializations and re-demarcations occurring through lawfare, warfare, or through design. China is also building islands on land, right, in Xinjiang or across Africa, in the latter case gated communities that resemble others in the USA and in Europe. Many world powers are involved in exactly the same venture. Cities also are full of islands. Some are visible, many are not. We see this in so-called secure urban neighborhoods in, say, Johannesburg or Sao Paulo, which have their own private police forces, their own commercial facilities, their own medical clinics. We see it in special economic and free trade zones and in airports and in prisons. And we see this, for example, in the very current attempts going on right now by the state of Georgia in the USA to prevent voting on weekends at exactly the time when African-American voter enfranchisement movements like Souls to the Polls do their most effective work. And this proposes a space that exists below the legal threshold, the legal envelope of the nation, where specific rules apply, where certain possible social acts may or may not take place. As Shakespeare wrote in Macbeth, the earth hath islands, the earth hath bubbles as the waters have, right? Those newly reclaimed islands in the world's oceans are very, very important. An equally important component to these are islands that are being built on land. In Singapore, for example, islands are often literally bubbles delineated by air quality. We saw this in the recent events of transboundary haze originating in Indonesia. Spaces of wealth were immediately identifiable as islands of breathability. After some study, one of our local air quality experts who works at National University of Singapore, it's my colleague, confirmed that large volume HVAC systems of the kind designed to serve megastructures like Singapore's 10-story shopping centers, they found that these performed best at filtering out the PM 2.5 fines in haze from the peat fires that were occurring nearby. So it was the islands of high capital that worked best as last stands against the apocalyptic nearby despoliations of the palm oil industry. What's perhaps most interesting about these new islands, mushrooming everywhere, is that their borders rarely, if ever, coincide with the boundaries of the state. As I'll argue in a moment, their geopolitical effectiveness stems precisely from the fact that they do not align with the state. They redraw critical borders both within and without. In fact, what's amusing about former President Trump's simple-minded concept of a border wall is how out of step it is with the reality of state territoriality. And this is really purely symbolic politics. And other walls are under construction, and the important ones stand pretty much anywhere except at the actual boundary of the nation. And this is, of course, quite a new paradigm. The classical way to think about an island, its geographical essence was defined by the exclusion of everything else, right? It's a singularity. And I'll argue shortly that this is largely a fantasy of the Western colonial imagination, that islands have typically operated within systems and often with complexly heterotopic physical and social interiors. However, theory of the island is not such an easy thing to decipher. And it is, I think, in large part due to the nature of islands themselves, the kind of dominant historical sense that they are unknowable, inscrutable, undefinable, characterized not by any essence, but by a kind of a lack. An island is what it is not. It is what it does not contain. For this talk, I've circulated a paper written a number of years ago about the island as a disciplinary form. This used the example of the US military camps at Guantanamo Bay, their history as a geographical device for the control, ostensibly, first of communism, later of Haitian immigrants, many of whom were HIV positive, and more recently, those imprisoned in Camp X-Ray as enemy combatants in a vaguely defined war on terror. And I attempt to show in that paper how Gitmo becomes a space of almost carnivalesque inversion and contradiction. The daily life in the facility becomes like a theater of the absurd. The male prisoners are made to dress up as women, to walk and eat like dogs, to bark at images of Osama bin Laden and that sort of thing, right? In fact, we see even that the figure of the enemy combatant itself is at best a paradox or an assembly of paradoxical concepts. And there's a process where the guards start to experience mental illness, start seeing themselves also as prisoners, seeing their interrogations as being interrogations by the prisoners, as tortures of the would-be torturers. And the central theme of recollections, confessions, and memoirs of those who inhabited this ironically named Camp X-Ray is this kind of total incomprehension, this inability to see or define what the place is or what happens there. So Guantanamo is this space where the inverse of the liberal nation state is enacted, where we, as the USA, do all the things that we do not do. Right? And I've argued that this can happen precisely because of Guantanamo's strange colonial history as an island and as a place that is by law owned by Puerto Rico and by convention under the sovereignty of the Americans. So in this paper, I'll argue that islands are in effect spaces of imagination that have to do with unusually high concentrations of power. Magic, in effect, that transforms or recuperates, it inverts, or most importantly, corrects. In fact, the late modern state always tries to produce islands outside of itself where real, unreal work can be done. After all, these have long been linked in the cultural imagination with transformative forces and speculative social forms, right? Especially in the phantasmagorias of environmental determinism. So a quick look through the Dictionary of Imaginary Places, one of my favorite books, has more than 80% of these located on islands. And some of these are classical. For example, if you think of Shakespeare's Tempest, right, where the magician Prospero transforms the passengers of the ship, the Prince Royal. Some of these are pulpy fantasy, like the island of Dr. Moreau, in which humans are hybridized with animals. But more seriously, Thomas More's Utopia, which you see on the right side here, from which the word utopia derives originally, right, was also an island. And so was Aldous Huxley's State of Pala, which was a utopian experimental society set in the waters halfway between Sumatra and the Andaman Islands. And this radiates through kind of current pulp media also, right? So you can see from the movie posters here, so almost any time some form of extreme biosocial engineering is about to happen on screen, you can almost bet that it's going to take place on an island. In the famous literary examples, magical forces restore the proper order of things, right? Settling accounts, setting all the wrongs of the outside world to rights. And this is clearly the case with the Tempest, but this notion of the uncanny power of islands also infiltrates some much more realist examples. So the great Herman Melville, right, in his more straightforward description of the islands known as the Encantadas, the Galapagos Islands, which we see here in the slide, described them as looking pretty much as the world at large might after a penal conflagration, that is, after the purifying fires of hell. But the dominant factor of Melville's account is that the islands cannot be understood, right? In fact, they can't even be found. Melville wrote about the difficulty of navigators in fixing the position of the Encantadas. So along with their unpredictable winds and currents, difficulty of locating these led to this name, the Wandering Islands, or the Enchanted Group, the Encantadas. So Melville describes this place where wicked sailors are, he says, at death, and in some cases before death, transformed into tortoises, straightforward monsters century after century writhing through the shades. That these tortoises are the victims of a penal or malignant or perhaps a downright diabolical enchanter. So this is really the imaginary, the boundedness of intensification of power that's deployed within a kind of miniature or model of broader social space. So in the geographical imagination, the island is always already a laboratory, a kind of control space, to quote Rem Koolhaas's description of Singapore, for the exercise of fantastic potential, a kind of territorial singularity where the bizarre and the impossible become normalized. There's a notional, certainly a practical idea of an inverse relationship between the power to control subjects and the size of the area in which that power is exercised, of spatial extension and the creation of the coastlines of the social world. So while virtually anything can happen on an island, the island itself is a sort of nothing, kind of non-territory, or in the literal translation of the word utopia, a no place. So they're utopias, and just as often they're prisons. I've noted in the essay that the phrase island prison contains perhaps a built-in redundancy, right? All prisons are to some extent islands, and at least in the colonial mindset, all islands are also prisons. No, I guess except the British islands, I suppose. But there was this overwhelming tendency decades before Guantanamo to put the worst penitentiaries on islands. The French geographer Joel Bonmaison quotes Michel Tournier, to whom he refers as an insular foe, right? Saying an island is a prison, it's Cayenne, it's Devil's Island or Reunion. An island functions like a closing over, not a privileged place. Grant McCall recalls from his fieldwork in Rapa Nui that Chilean public officials posted in the South Pacific used this term islitis to describe a condition of madness of being on islands. It was similar to what's been called kind of stir crazy in the American prison system. So this is more than merely an idea of the insular or the carceral, right? An agency is also possible in these forgotten places, right? An ability to fundamentally reshape human life, which would be simply unthinkable elsewhere. So they become a sort of a spatial tool, a kind of magic circle, again, in the Shakespearean example, to invert and later to correct. And this continues today very much. There's a sort of sentimental industry in thinking and writing about islands. On the screen here are all recent books on the subject in which authors go in search of islands for reasons that they cannot quite explain. In fact, they hope to discover the source of their attraction for islands. And they hope more than anything else that these islands will fix them. But just as much, these actually recount futile attempts to understand what islands are. The most recent work in this genre, Gavin Francis's Island Dreams, expresses a kind of unrequited love, the sort of gazing, unknowability, obsession, strange affect. Francis spends the whole book speculating about why he's drawn to islands via a kind of magnetism. And it's not a spoiler alert, he does not figure it out. Right? He ends the book in the same kind of ignorance in which he begins. So interestingly, the crises and obsessions that are recounted in these books are almost always epistemic in nature. Right? The authors travel to islands so that they may grasp something definitively without the ambient noise of a connected or collected modern life. These typically start with a kind of a failure in knowing, right? An uncomprehended end of a relationship, or this existential angst and stupefaction, say, brought on by the death of a loved one. So the authors posit all kinds of theories about the power essence of islands, or at least of our expectations of them, our cultural associations, and our fixations. And that, for example, the idea that it's the ruthless limitation, right, the total privation of islands that returns us back to ourselves. There's just nothing there, and we retreat to them from the world in order to transform ourselves, to kind of rebuild ourselves as if we are in a cocoon. So the discursive figure of the desert island focuses on simplicity, right, on a life away from objects or conveniences, structures, arrangements, contracts, and contraptions. And this is clearly the joke of this kind of never-ending trope of cartoons, kind of perennial classic, the castaways on the absurdly small island, right, where the sheer lack of everything, except, you know, maybe the occasional coconut, makes all other aspects of modern life seem kind of ridiculous. It's the same concept, by the way, behind the longest running BBC radio program, Desert Island Discs, in which celebrities and politicians are forced to choose only 8 records, which they could take with them into isolation forever. So the privation of the island is the power that forces these kinds of essential choices. Likewise, the islands of this kind of, let's say, upper middle brow travel lit nearly always recreate a kind of fictive state of nature that's also at the base of almost all Enlightenment theories of society, right? And after Logier, theories of architecture also. So a moment when we decide to band together to subjugate human and natural others, in this case of Robinson Crusoe, for example, in order to remake the world from the very beginning. So this is a mythology that Marx famously rejected, right? The notion of a moment in history prior to social relations. There are kind of fantasy islands without people in which we're the first or the last people on Earth. And there are those that are about social construction, right? Books like Lord of the Flies, where we rehearse the famous histories of liberalism and the origins of the state. So the island's power comes from, in part, this oppositional relationship that it has to community. It embodies a society that's kind of lost its mass character, to use Walter Benjamin's language, thus can be kind of rebuilt under controlled circumstances. So Crusoe does this. Right? It's the ultimate colonial fantasy of rebuilding the West outside of itself, and where Friday, the quote unquote native, is but an extension of nature itself. So the island is a kind of laboratory, and the laboratory works, as Bruno Latour tells us, only because it can be isolated from reality, and reality's many multifactorial confusions. So in the sense, the unfixed and unreal, so writers like Gavin Francis, for example, fixate on this return to the solitude, to the insulation of the island as a way to kind of solve modern personal problems through a retrograde motion back to a moment of purity, a kind of Edenic condition before the problems of the social, a rediscovery of the self in the figure of the noble savage, an idea which Colin Rowe would place at the root of all utopian movements since the Renaissance. Well, so much for popular culture, right? But the academic or the geophysical analysis of islands is also a very problematic undertaking, precisely because of the same kind of epistemic slipperiness, this resistance to being defined or known or made real. So to reference W.H. Auden's lovely quote, islands appear to insist on being unreal. So with the study of islands, we're attempting to kind of know the unknowable, and unknowability is not, honestly speaking, a very proper, valid object of scholarly inquiry. And this was the point that I tried to make in this article titled Built on Sand, that even the immaterial nature of islands was a precarious basis for the study of the subject. So I argue that unlike land or soil, entities with kind of diverse sedimentary histories, microstructures, and transactional interior arrangements that kind of can be scientifically classified and taxonomized, sand is precarious and kind of largely anomic. And the territory that emerges from sand is likewise granular and unreliable, with the coastlines of nations increasingly moving around, migrating to be absorbed in the coastlines of others, like we see in Singapore. And sand is mainly defined by an irregular outline and a few chemical properties. Unlike soil, a large collection of sand is not something else, it's just more sand. So its collectivity is merely an accumulation of individual instances. So I argued that the materiality of sand told one nothing about islands except to describe a kind of transient and in effect purely formal existence. So in this sense, the unfixed and unreal character of an island, its mobility, is reflected perfectly in its materiality. So the mobility of sand aggregated is the mobility of the coastline, the island's geobody. I've kind of experienced this myself as a practitioner. So working on the interior design of a hotel on this island in the Maldives, my partner and I were amused that the coastline couldn't be relied upon to plan or design a beach or umbrellas or anything whatsoever. At the beginning of the year, the beach was here, as you can see from this outline. And by 4 months later, the tides had migrated it all the way around to the other side. And we were told that this was a twice annual occurrence. So this changed the very nature of the coastline. And it was in many ways the same and not the same island. So no wonder that writer Paul Carter has argued for the resistance of the coastline to scientific knowledge. Ironically, this is the line that we draw on maps, right, to define the land of the nation, but which, because of tide or erosion or sand smuggling or climate change, is never going to remain actually where we drew it. At the same time, nationalized island edges are also conjectural and debated and typically do not exist where the land meets the water. This is the reason for the ongoing argument between Singapore and its neighbors about the location of their maritime border, which for shipping and defense is really the de facto boundary of the nation. So even this is a kind of a fiction, as the actual hinterland of Singapore, as Milica and Hans have shown, extends far beyond its territorial bounds, right? Singapore, while being an island, is actually a kind of an archipelago, which is perhaps a kind of ideal territorial formation for the current state, and the configuration desired by China and other nations with neo-colonial ambitions. So given this, the kind of fundamental nature is something transformative, powerful, and resistant to knowing, how would we begin to theorize the nature of the island in the geopolitical contemporary? This is the subject of my research. And how does a renewed emphasis on the island potentially signal a kind of reconfiguration of the nation state and its territoriality, right? What's the general theory that's at work here? And I think we can kind of tentatively begin to propose some axioms, say, or hypotheses about the subject, right? And these are each a kind of a little bit different, but they share a common consequence, a kind of necessary shift in our thinking away from the idea of bounded territory as being internally consistent, as a kind of medium or extensive space that's governed by a set of common rules or qualities or values or economics. So I'll describe some of these axioms to you. The first is that an island is a bounded thing, a world unto itself. This may sound crashingly obvious to you. Of all of the island's contradictory associations, right? Magical and barren, social vacuum, and an entire world, its single fundamental common and consistent characteristic is its finitude, right? The island may grow and absorb others, like Singapore famously has done, or it may exist on land, like a campus or a prison, but it does not transcend its limitations. Compared to the ocean or the hinterland around it, every island is, in effect, a small island. 2, islands keep some things in and leave others out. In essence, the island is a fortress. It may or may not have a controlled perimeter. I would say most do not, or a cliff wall around the outside. Very often, its defenses lie in being remote, irrelevant, or hard to find. As Peter Borschberg has shown, my island, Singapore, was misplaced in one way or another for most of the 17th century, shown in various locations and forms in maps with different names and different written records. So maps of Malaysia and the Straits with different iterations of Singapore are currently being digitized by my colleague at Yale NUS, Jane Jacobs. So at least in theory, this makes the island defensible. Its chief weakness, that is, that it's small and vulnerable and surrounded by a vast expanse, is also kind of its primary advantage. An island can be an oasis, right? An island, or the perfect inversion of one, that's intensely hard to get to, for example. Or it can be like a caravanserai with the walls and a gate. And the key factor is not so much its defensibility, but its inaccessibility. 3, being bounded and finite, the island is subject to its own conditions. As a limited and obviously closed unit of territory, the island has its own qualities and conditions. It may enforce its own sovereignty, its own laws, its own currency and economics, its own practices, language or jargon, social expectations or hierarchies. And this is precisely why utopias like Thomas More's, which operated according to very different and unconventional practices, were set on islands and available to very limited contact, effectively cut off from the mainland. And the same was true also of Fourier's ideal socialist community experiments. 4, islands may be anomalous. As the legal scholar Gerald Newman has pointed out, islands are often associated with states of emergency, with summary laws and codes, secret operations, and cones of silence. So black sites and disconnected zones may be places in which the general law of a territory can be suspended. This was the case of islands in the British Empire, which followed law that was totally different from the home territory. Among others, Edward Said pointed out that liberal and progressive constitutional nations often enforced completely opposed, violently repressive and dictatorial legal conditions on their outlying islands. It's the case also on military bases like Guantanamo and in defensible areas that are used for national security operations within many nations. 5, the island is where the nation state increasingly constructs the opposite of itself. The state needs to construct islands, organs that are liberated from its self-imposed constraints. So this is a kind of dangerous business, right? Black sites, bubbles, spaces of pure potentiality are needed in particular by liberal democracies so that the realpolitik of their survival can be enacted. So put another way, all liberal states have illiberal instruments, and islands are where these can be deployed. So exceptions in any constitutional state will sooner or later be spatialized. And as a result, nations have typically utilized internal or external islands to do the things that are against their fundamental principles. So this was the case of torture or so-called enhanced interrogation methods used in the wake of 9/11, for example. For the liberal state, the island effectively is illiberalism at work. But it's also the case of red light districts, special economic zones where ostensibly state socialist nations like China can pursue freewheeling economic enterprises. In effect, the island allows the performance of acts that contradict or invert our beliefs. 6, islands allow for the new form of the nation state, which is built upon the inconsistency of its internal space. So unevenness of wealth, of law, security, and risk, etc. John Agnew, the geographer, brilliantly described the concept of the territorial trap, the notion that territories, because they are territories, are internally coherent or consistent. In the past 4 decades, the efflorescence of islands within national territories matches a shift away from a concept of the state as a space of common internal conditions. So post-colonies, especially existing typically as they are existing in advance of the so-called global north, already understand the state as a kind of assembly or conflation of islands. They operate in effect as archipelagos. So there's little resemblance between cities in the countryside. And again, those familiar with cities like Joburg or Sao Paulo know all too well the extreme conditions of contrast and the fortified bubbles of relative wealth, power, risk, or health or environmental quality. As described more than 50 years ago by Frantz Fanon, the colonial world is a kind of Manichaean construct, right? It exists in a series of enclosed units that are forced via violence to coexist in a common boundary. So it's not the difference, but the presumption of a common territorial container where the violence becomes important. So the centrifugal character of the system has to continually be kind of held together. The modern state, or the late modern state, by contrast, has spent much of the Enlightenment period apparently consolidating and performing its uniformity, its consistency, and its coherence. It reaches apex with the Great Society imagery of America in the 1950s. However, the reality of the territorial unit is its refractory nature. Right? It's full of dark pockets and shadow states, local conditions, and inequalities. So the late modern neoliberal approach to statehood on the rise since the 1970s, by contrast, appears to simply acknowledge extreme difference. So America can be effectively a nation of the global South with hyper-developed islands, or vice versa. So living conditions for America as poor bear no actual relation to its status as the world's wealthiest economy. And this has become clearer in indexes like the rising Gini coefficient, which measures wealth polarization and is made starkly visible with the kind of distributive violence of COVID-19 as we've seen it played out in the Anglo-American context in different communities. In America, likewise, the punishment that you'll be served for a crime that you commit nowadays is determined actually less by the crime itself and more by the location in which the crime is committed. Certain states, like Palestine, for example, it's not a state, but a territory, are perhaps the most extreme cases. So here we see a map of territorial islands and checkpoints dividing the West Bank, such that one must cross from island to island to island simply to stay within the same apparent territorial block. What's often presented to the public as Palestinian territory is quite literally a kind of an archipelago of fragments where you can barely go from here to there without passing through Israeli territory like gates, checkpoints, or military emplacements. 7, islands create differences of law, value, or other that are essential to the functioning of capital. For complex reasons that go beyond the scope of this talk, the operation of late capital increasingly requires geographical difference and the presence of borders. So the late Edward Soja described the spatial requirement of capital to move between high and low value areas, to perform valuation and devaluation, and to arbitrage across multiple currencies and multiple labor markets. Soja demonstrated this phenomenon in particular with respect to the US-Mexico border, which he called the geographical transfer of value. David Harvey actually has argued that this takes place among normal city neighborhoods as well. Islands form networks. Mobility across networks is a modality of social power. Bronislaw Malinowski, in his classic anthropological work on the Trobriand island groups, was initially really puzzled when he was doing his research about the trade in kula, right, in items that were made typically of small shells and of having no real kind of functional specific use. Malinowski wondered, right, why anyone would risk rowing a canoe for hundreds of kilometers to exchange these objects that were purely ornamental and had no inherent value. What's more, the ring of kula trade had a very, very coordinated pattern, right? Certain items were traded from north to south in a kind of a clockwise formation, others in the opposite direction. Malinowski learned that kula were associated with prestige. You can see them here on the right, a kind of map of Trobriand on the left. The prestige wasn't associated with the courage of the sea voyages, but an indication of social connectedness. So kula exchanges, which were not monetary or transactional in any way, created relations of mutual obligation that established an individual's social importance, and in fact, their kind of connectedness or entanglement with other individuals elsewhere. But even more, Malinowski showed that what were thought of as desert islands was actually a complex network of relations in which social power came from the ability to move from one island to another. Other anthropologists have shown similar relations among other island groupings across the world. So connectivity of islands is often ignored. And there's no industry of books about archipelagos the same way there is an industry of books about islands. But if you follow the contemporary, say, Johannesburger, someone with, say, high income and social capital, you'll notice that she or he typically move across an archipelago of secure bubbles, a gated home with security, for example, a gym with card swipe access, malls with armed guards, etc. So social power and status in that case, likewise, has everything to do with the ability to move across islands and between them. 9, lastly, the iconic quality of islands out there conceals their presence as infrastructure. So lastly, I'd like to argue that islands are a form of infrastructure. When we think of infrastructure as a category, we don't typically think of islands first and foremost. We think of connective tissues, linear elements, matrices, and the like. We have things like power plants, but these are typically there to feed some form of extensive tissue in a way that a root ball, for example, allows vines or creepers to grow. These are not separated or isolated elements. But our cities and states rely heavily on islands. In Singapore, already a very small place, we have islands for waste, islands for potable water, islands for the dead, export processing zones, islands of sand and gravel waiting to be added to our coastline. We have a literal island within our island that processes petrochemicals. We have another for theme parks and for gambling, and an island that holds crew from foreign boats. That is, we have an island inside Singapore that is not Singapore. And our embassies, and probably yours, work very much the same way. So these infrastructures exist, but have often gone unrecognized and without understanding what properties and affordances islands bring as infrastructural forms. So these suggest perhaps a kind of expanded concept of infrastructure, bringing to light other critical arrangements or allowances, provisional accommodations that might change the way that we think about what this category comprises. So by way of conclusion, I'd like to return quickly to the question of materiality, that is the materiality of the island. And this is something which until recently would have been considered kind of so obvious as to not even be worth thinking about, right? We're all familiar with the image of what an island is. It's kind of etched in our minds to the point that this materiality, right? The bright sandy coastline, the dunes, the seagrass, the kind of rising, darkening bank where the trees and shrubs kind of signal the boundary of the interior, or beyond the tropical trope, we have the kind of angular outcroppings of the North Seas or the basaltic tuff of places like the Faroe Islands, for example. So these are really kind of iconic images that probably come to mind when we think of it. But just as often nowadays is this. I don't know if these are, by the way, ubiquitous where you are. In Singapore, we have to scan these every time we enter, say, a building or a cafe or a university lecture hall or a shop or a hospital, basically any single secure area that's not a park or a street or a public place. And they kind of register identities for contact tracing so that if there's a confirmed positive case of COVID-19, they can be correlated to somebody who might have been at the same place at the same time. And then we check out when we leave. And increasingly, we occupy several apparently immaterial islands at once, right? COVID bubbles, digital friend groups, WhatsApp chats, or echo chambers, algorithmic enclosures that increasingly kind of determine what sort of news you read, what facts you receive, or in the case of the US, algorithms that determine the price of your interest payments on a home or a loan, the amount of time you may spend in jail if you're actually convicted of a crime. So these islands are not metaphorical, right? Digital forms of access create a climate of rights and access to basic social goods, potentially life-saving information and services, and lately vaccines that will determine your range of movement. So these are an infrastructure as central as any other. And we might ask, how do immaterial islands play a role in our lives, right? Do physical and non-physical islands require each other? It's interesting, for example, that among currently famous examples, both material and immaterial islands share a common materiality, which is sand, right? This is the material technical substrate of our digital enclosures also. WhatsApp, Telegram groups, listservs, Netflix. It's microprocessors built on sand, built on silica dioxide. And another major source of sand loss, in addition to coastal reclamation, is this. I love this sticker on the left because it kind of totally deflates this dematerialized utopian pretentiousness of the new economy, right? And now these processing farms are not physically isometric with the islands that they create, right? The spatial distribution of users of like a closed social media group, for example, does not coincide with the physical location of their underlying servers, right? In fact, the laws that abide in the location of the one may not coincide with those of the other. And this is a repeated tension, for example, that we see over and over again with like Google and in China, right? The material basis of these may actually be, you know, something like Silicon Valley, which is itself very much an archipelago of bounded spaces and campuses accessible to folks in one particular economy. Or they may be in this kind of emergent gulag of server farms existing on very low value land with cheap power and corporate tax incentives. And this is important more generally because islands are really this new currency in geopolitics, but not necessarily in the way that we recognize. And certainly there appears to be a current return to a kind of Cold War emphasis on physicality, on actually reclaiming land, building land out of the sea, facts on the ground or of the ground, despite the ostensible kind of dematerialization of both politics and production. And this is why we have this kind of frightening brinksmanship in the South China Seas. But it's a kind of a dual, I would argue, contradictory process. Equally important are islands that have apparently no materiality. So there's an emphasis both on dirt and on code, on medium and immediacy, right? The informatic islands of knowledge and opinion, common sense or cultural affiliation determine at least the outcome of elections or action or inaction on things like climate emergency. So this seems pressing also as kind of new forms of illiberalism experiment with the territories of our physical and political lives, right? The idea of the island, whether it's surrounded by water or not, inevitably re-enters into the fantasism of social control. And I believe that COVID has merely accelerated this process of isolation, a word which means, by the way, literally islanding, giving the urgency of emergency to the development of a series of technologies, tactics, compliances, urban and architectural forms, norms like this meeting, norms like Zoom, that support the modern state as an archipelago. In this global order, we'll increasingly inhabit islands. We may find ourselves like the Trobrianders moving between them. Indeed, the ability to do so will soon be a major, if not the major, source of social power and prestige, as it was in Micronesia. Or we may find ourselves like Defoe, cast away, forced to create an entire world within the tiny compass of, say, an apartment or a neighborhood or a room. So insulation maybe is the new literacy, that indispensable skill of our future, together and apart. And I will stop there and maybe we can move toward discussion.
Thank you so much, Josh. It's amazing to hear you talk, and really many questions indeed. I mean, I am. Let me see. I made a couple of notes. I mean, I wonder to what extent. Do you see that the kind of island phenomenon that you describe is is connected to or is a kind of a counter reaction to globalization? Are we seeing in a way a island as a kind of a post the world, the post globalized world, or is it to what extent does it have to do with the let's say with carving out a kind of space of control within or against the planetary networks, or is this a new kind of paradigm of governance? In the Hinterland project, for example, we have, on the one hand, it's obvious that, to control or to let's say global supply chains, we need some type of global governance institutions, no, in a kind of positive sense, right? And we need a few kind of universal values and so on, right? And what we see is exactly the opposite. We see the kind of splintering, further splintering, and the kind of further to say so, power division, within this globalized space, right? So in a sense, I think what you're describing is it's a kind of politics that has its dangers, right? I mean, there was obviously grave dangers, but on the other hand, I mean, you mentioned people like Huxley, right? So let's say there is also kind of tradition on the left of this kind of utopian imaginary, right? So anarchism, socialist utopias. I mean, Huxley was part of those in California and so on. So let's say it is not really obvious that island is necessarily a kind of a negative paradigm, right? or in the contemporary conditions. So I'm wondering, if we could go perhaps in that direction. Of course, before. Let's say as part of our conversation.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. And I think to answer kind of your first point, Milica, I really believe that there was a kind of a rhetorical tropism of globalization, right? There was a series of metaphors that were employed over and over again, particularly in urban theory and in social science, et cetera, which was about a kind of an expansion, a networking, a lateralization. And I think in many cases, what we saw also that was a kind of an unrecognized or less recognized phenomenon were forms of localization, fragmentation, enclosure, protection. Like, for example, I spend a lot of time in South Africa. That's why I mentioned Johannesburg in my talk. You could see there with certain kinds of multilateral agreements, with the influx of certain kinds of wealth and the expansion of certain kinds of elites as they globalized, there were also suddenly new forms of inequity that we saw coming up, a new paranoia about wealth, a new tendency to kind of polarize spatially in a way that the city had. And of course, this was occurring at the same time as the end of apartheid, right? So there's a whole series of other very complicated histories of exclusion and social justice there. But what I mean is that, if we look at the work of, say, people like Michael Storper, who've been looking at kind of market integration, what they see is, on the one hand, a tremendous tendency toward global connectivity. On the other hand, what they see is the greatest kind of explosion in wealth polarity that's probably happened since the mid-19th century. And that has certain kinds of effects, right? The same way that it did, say, during the height of the Industrial Revolution in the major kind of metropoles in cities like Manchester and Chicago and London and so on. But I agree with you absolutely. And I think that islands do not lose also this kind of utopian aspect, right? I mean, and I'm 100% guilty of this, right? I'm a member of these kinds of, you know, farming communes where we get our kind of our vegetables grown, you know, in the Cameron Highlands, and you know,
Right.
unity of kind of ethical treatment of workers, you know, all of this kind of stuff, right? So we all kind of find ways of making demarcations, and I think at the same time, you know, in no small way, modes of organization of this kind, forms of concentration, are also the source of political action, right? I mean, you know, movements for forms of urban social justice often take place by first identifying themselves and finding common ground, which they initially work from. I think of, for example, the Ground Up initiative in Singapore, for example, is another one like that. So it's not for me necessarily a kind of a dystopian form so much as the recognition that this idea that the state is somehow a kind of a blank, like John Agnew used to say, it was like a billiard ball, right? It has sort of a boundary, and then the inside of whatever was in there was consistent. It's the same all the way through, right? And what we know is that increasingly, since the kind of the end of the kind of 60s counterculture moment, we know that the state is actually polarizing, fragmenting, creating more and more spaces for its own exceptions and its own kind of contrary activities. And that was something that I found kind of particularly terrifying.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a fascinating point, and you know, in relation, obviously, to you know, many examples, but Singapore is certainly one of those states that has this kind of very skillful hand in the kind of construction of this exceptionality, let's say, or the kind of archipelago of exceptions. That's really fascinating. Thank you so much. It's so Zoom doesn't really let us see each other very well. I invite Charlotte. Charlotte, are you there?
Yeah, of course I'm here. I was just listening. Thank you so much, Joshua, for this lecture. I think it's really so interesting to dissect this kind of spatial phenomenon. I had a question that was perhaps a little bit mean. But of course, I'm very familiar with your work on sand, and as you were mentioning the kind of at the beginning of your talk, you mentioned how you would discuss the kind of materialities, of course, of the island. And I was just wondering, since you've now moved, let's say, further away, or let's say not away, but you know, further deeper into the kind of let's say also conceptual understanding of what islands do or what they do not do. In fact, I was wondering if there was any way that you could still relate some of the aspects that you've identified on how the islands perform as a kind of extraterritorial state, or I mean, as Easterling put it, the kind of extra state, these materialities, and in fact the materialities of these islands as at times being entirely made out of, or almost entirely made out of materials that are in fact you know, have external sources. Do you have a kind of externalization of extraction in that sense, and how these islands are in fact made of stuff that is not sourced there, or even kind of like about the shifting of these supplies. So I was wondering if there was a way that you could tell us how the research, even how the research in fact evolved from your kind of Singaporean island research to where you are now.
In a way, the two are actually kind of, I think, going somewhat in parallel tracks, because in a way, my other big trends of research, the other big side of this, is kind of the role of landscape and ecological and environmental thinking and language, and how that is becoming increasingly part of the kind of state and island building project. So for example, Milica was talking about the kind of the compartmentalizing brilliance of Singapore, and very often what I find is that there are behind this very often explanations that have to do with biodiversity, with you know, kind of the keeping sacred of certain kinds of historical or heritage sites, the preservation of certain species, and the tactical use of certain kinds of landscape. And I still actually believe very strongly that the making of islands in a way is always physical. I mean, the interesting thing about the slipperiness of sand as well it's very easy to kind of cover those traces, right? That the island still needs to be made. And in a way, it still needs to be made real, right? So Charles Lim, whose work I showed a slide or two of his kind of those horizontal sandwiches that he did for Sea State, has been working on the exact process by which, for example, sand becomes land in Singapore. There's an incredibly complicated technical legal procedure where the sand has to sit for a certain period of time. It has to be beaten down by a kind of a machine that drives around. It has to be tamped to a certain density or hardness. It then has to be tested. They then have to write up a kind of a plea to the president or to the prime minister to go and say, please, sir, can we convert this kind of square meter of sand into land, and can it be part of the Singaporean landmass? So there's this very complicated legal kind of choreography of material and of converting something which, as I've argued, like sand is a very, very tricky, slippery, kind of unaligned sort of material into something that has the character of land, nationhood, actual kind of national space. So I think what to answer your question, although I can't kind of really summarize the breadth of that research, what I'm very interested now is the way in which these kind of two discourses. One is about kind of material transformations, i.e. what happens to the material once it gets to us. And the other side with questions of kind of preservation, sea level rise, coastal access, localized fishing initiatives, all of this kind of stuff then becomes kind of part of the management of the island, not only as a securitized space, but also as a way of trying to bring people back kind of into an affective relationship with it. So for example, in Singapore, this may have happened after you left Singapore. When did you leave Singapore?
2013.
Okay, so this happened within the last 5 years.
We were a bit later.
It grew. Yeah, Milica stated it grew in the meantime.
Yeah.
I mean, I received a little packet in the mail. As long as you were a PR or a citizen, you got a packet that contained 4 seeds for kind of native species that you were supposed to go out and plant. And this was about the government trying through NParks to create what they call biophilia, which is effectively a kind of affective relationship between Singaporeans and their land, their natural landscape. But very often these were to be planted in places like Marina Bay, right, on reclaimed land, which now is still kind of these very flat, kind of windblown plateaus of cow grass, right? So there is still a very interesting kind of material anxiety, as well as of a set of kind of emergent practices, which I think very often take on the form of environmentalist language, but not the newest environmentalist language, a kind of maybe 10-year or 20-year-old environmentalist language that has become adopted in part as kind of the language of state.
Thanks. That's fascinating. I also find the idea of material anxiety extremely interesting. Maybe we could turn to Faiq, who is your respondent, and I'm sure has some great insight into or questions into this discussion on islands. Faiq?
Yeah, thanks, Charlotte, and thanks, Milica and Hans, for the invitation. And thanks, Joshua, for the amazing and very dense, I have to say, presentation. It gives us a lot to think about. And maybe to start from the last point and Charlotte's question about the materiality, I think that in what you've presented and what you have given us to read, you showed us how, like, if sand attests to the fluidity of the territory and its border and its sovereignty, air attests to the perviousness of the borders, and thus to the constant need for the creation of barriers that transpose this imaginary of the island into reality, serving capital, serving security, serving the state, etc. And from here, it gets very interesting for me to think of the different axioms that you have presented, not as eternal truths or universal realities, but rather as maybe, as you have mentioned earlier, concrete abstractions, which the actors are constantly trying to materialize through the different materials, through the different designs, and etc. You have showed us, for example, how the construction of architecture in Singapore materializes the conception about air, in its different forms. And so for me, it's quite interesting to see what you think about the materialization of these axioms, how they are materially created and recreated. To go into another point, I think like the concept of island that you have presented is very interesting, both metaphorically and analytically, but also historically. And so maybe I want us to talk and go back a little bit about the historical aspect of it. For example, you have presented the example of Palestine with the archipelago of the West Bank and the different metaphorical islands there, but you have also presented the example of South Africa and other examples as well. And clearly what joins Palestine and South Africa is their case of settler colonialism, but also this takes us to the United States as well, which is a settler colony and happens to be the core of capital in the world right now. And so I am wondering, why do you think that island has become the new paradigm of the nation state? How might that be related to settler colonialism and the current form of globalized capital? And also, like, how can we go back in history to read that? Maybe David Lloyd, for example, in one article of his, talks about the new paradigm of hyperlegality and the topology of zones of exclusion. He traces this back to the colonies, but particularly to settler colonies, to the notion of the siege mentality of the settler colony, and also to the hyperlegality in operation in settler colonies, particularly British ones, but also others. And like, I don't want to take much more time, but I'm interested in the historical background of what you have presented today as something that you have mentioned briefly, but I'm sure that there is more to discuss about it.
Yeah, thank you, Faiq. That's a fantastic question. And I want to, I think, kind of underscore a slight difference in what I've said, to make sure that I haven't misrepresented it in my comments, which is not that I don't feel that the island is a new territorial paradigm, but I do feel that it's coming into a new kind of dominance, or say a new overtness, or a new shamelessness, or a kind of a newly revived use as a power technology and as a territorial technology. I agree with you absolutely. I think that the history of the island is as old as our kind of colonially produced nations, right? And I think definitely in America, we have for a long, long time had de facto islands. I think what was interesting was for a long time that there was a mythology that we were a kind of constitutional state with a generalized climate of rights and equalities and entitlements. And there was an attempt to kind of deny the fact that there were very, very discrete islands of settlement that came from the logic of a kind of a settler culture, or settler kind of a realpolitik, right? So I think what's happening now is, in a way, two things. One is that we are starting to see once again the islands that have been there, but have been in a state of kind of concealment or denial, are starting to kind of be delineated once again, are being kind of dusted off. In many cases, are being reused in much the same way that they have, you know, for hundreds of years, right? If I think about the condition of, say, immigrant communities or African-American communities in the United States, who are facing modes of kind of space-based territorial delimitation now that obey exactly the same logic that they did during Jim Crow and far before that as well, right? And part of what kind of drew me to this, to the interest in this question of islands, was actually specifically their colonial kind of history, right? As having kind of spent a lot of time as a child in an apartheid city, having spent some time also in Israel, which I believe has very many resemblances to the city that I knew in South Africa, and the kind of logic, the kind of incredibly dominant logic of the role of the prison as a kind of a transformative technology, both for domination, but also for recreating idealized versions of the West all over the place, right? So one of the interesting things about the history of kind of panoptical prisons is very often they were tried out kind of under colonial rule in islands, right? The Andamans were basically where all of the agitators of the Raj were sent to get them out of the mainstream, right? It was a way of kind of exiling people, especially people who had anti-colonial kind of movements or leaders in anti-colonial movements. And one of the things that I think is very interesting about this history is precisely that kind of hyper-legalization that you mentioned, which on the one hand is incredibly intensive, and on the other totally bizarre. Like I mentioned in the Guantanamo article that for the British colonies, very often ships and islands were seen as kind of interchangeable entities, right? They would refer to islands as ships and give them ships' names, and the kind of state of summary kind of martial law that existed on islands was exactly the same as used on ships, by the British Navy, for example. So they were kind of modes of legalization, but also a kind of creep of the absurd, of a kind of an intensification of modes of legalism that very often kind of went way off the rails and went bananas, kind of in the way that, for example, we see in Guantanamo, in the history of Guantanamo. And this kind of brings me around, I guess, to kind of your first point, which I think is a really fascinating question, which is the one about materiality and whether these islands are, in a sense, at perfect, complete technologies, or whether they are kind of a process of trying to enact a form of power materially that in a weird way evades realization, right? Very often the attempt to create perfectly panoptical prisons, or prisons like, for example, the ones that were produced on islands, not under colonial rule, but in Thailand, for example, very often wound up with very complex kind of social circumstances where the prisoners themselves wound up running the prison and setting up a whole kind of series of kind of social conventions and rules and hierarchies and things kind of within the prison itself. So to answer that question, I think what's very interesting about the island is not its perfection, but its kind of attempt to be realized on its kind of axiomatic principles, which very often result in a kind of failure or a kind of absurdism. Like even the way that, happens in a utopian sense, to go back to Milica's point, that, if you read utopia, I mean, very often we think of utopia as an archetype, as a kind of perfect society. I mean, that's how it's used very often in kind of common parlance in the US, right? Very often though, like in More's utopia, it's just a society where a certain form of legalistic logic and a certain rule of pragmatic thought is taken so far that it becomes almost kind of crazy, right? It's a kind of reductio ad absurdum where the logic kind of turns back on itself. So there is this sense with the island as we are attempting to kind of realize its perfection and its potentials, it has a tendency to very often kind of go overboard or fail or fall apart or not do exactly what we want. I mean, the island is kind of slipping away as we are, in a way, trying to build it. I don't know if that's a fair answer to your question.
Definitely.
Thanks. I don't know, Hans, is there maybe you would like to jump in?
Yeah, maybe more as comments. Thank you for your talk. I think it's fantastic and super interesting. I was wondering, I mean, super interesting also the comment you made that the kind of moving between the islands, of course, becomes the kind of social power. I was wondering, thinking, I'm sorry to dive back again to sand, but having researched on how the sand lands in Singapore, yeah. That I was wondering that it's also the materiality, it's the power of moving the material between the islands. So maybe that's a tying back to this. That's because this is also becoming increasingly a kind of a strong moment of being able to construct your island in a way. And then it's not about constructing another island, but being able to move stuff between them is as much part of this power.
Yeah, build yourself out of a zone of kind of scarcity, right? I mean, what's really interesting is going back to look at the kind of history of discussion of islandness, even in, say, Lee Kuan Yew's rhetoric, going back to the early days of the PAP, the island was discursively, what it meant was lack. It was the island was poverty. The island was the quote third world that he always invoked and wanted to escape, right? And the idea was that we could build ourselves out of that by increasing, by making ourselves into a very large kind of island as opposed to to a small one. And he very much had Britain in mind, right? There was definitely his kind of school days there as a kind of a model of what the island could be. But I think what your point is really interesting and really well taken, because of course there's these massive contradictions in that power of moving material, right? we know that actually the way that it's moved is in a kind of a strange ad hoc series of small barges kind of being shipped in sub rosa, not purely legit, we don't know exactly where the sources come from, but then it's all veiled in this kind of proceduralism, in the language of national security, in the language of nation building. All the sand out there hides in plain sight, right? You can drive along the highway and you can see these massive kind of ziggurats of sand and of gravel. So in one sense, it has this kind of strange, furtive, kind of contradictory nature. On the one hand, it happens in plain sight, and it's treated with all of this language of kind of legalism and territory and nationalism. And on the other, it is really a kind of a strange and kind of furtive business. And the power to actually bring the sand over is very different from the power to kind of convert it, into territory and into national space. And I think that's a kind of very interesting contradiction that happens there with sand. And also the kind of the lack of a plan, right? I'm always on these kind of discussions with, various figures in government saying, well, we have a certain platform level at the coast. What happens when sea level rise comes above that? And there's a moment where you realize that territory that's been built, that kind of skirting around the edge of the island, is going to require a lot more kind of technical infrastructure in order for it to kind of survive. Yeah.
Thanks. May I just, I think we are inevitably being dragged into this conversation about somehow the materiality of sand. And I think that, as you said, since those are running in parallel, I think it's okay to actually address that. There is a question in the chat, which is, interrogating this idea of indigeneity land claims in Singapore and beyond. Jane Lowe asked, what do you make of work like the short film Lost World by Kelly and Mam, which of course you're familiar with. I also posted it as a link for everyone to have a look, which follows the trajectory of a dispossessed Cambodian fisherwoman to show the affective and ecological devastation of sand dredging in Cambodia for Singapore's development. How might that trouble the mobility and anonymity of the material? What might it say about Singapore's role as the island's heart of a minor empire in Southeast Asia? I think this also, in a way, nicely ties to Faiq's point and also to Hans. So maybe you would want to answer or at least give some thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's an excellent question and a wonderful short film, by the way. Anyone who's watching who hasn't seen it should definitely watch it. It's very, very powerful. And what it makes clear is that the anonymity, the flexibility of that material is very different in the politics of those receiving sand from those who are losing it, right? When we're losing sand from whatever other kind of geographical origin point it comes from, we are also losing the ecology associated with that sand, right? I mean, what we see with the destruction of not just coastlines, but also riverine environments in the Philippines, which have been also dredged to send sand over to here, is the loss of things like seagrass colonies, riverine and estuarine, ecosystems, and national territory, right? There was a great a Filipino filmmaker who joked that he was going to come over here to Gardens by the Bay, and plant the Philippine flag because all of the soil that had been used to reclaim that land around Marina Bay was from the Philippines, and he claimed it as Filipino territory, right? So, for those who are on the losing end of this transaction, which very often is a kind of a gray area or a legal transaction, this is not an anonymous material. It becomes anonymous and it's very easily anonymized. And that's what I argued in the Harvard Design Magazine article, was that part of the terrifying quality of sand is the ability to just wash it of its history. And in a sense, sand has this kind of agnostic quality. Once it has been removed from the ecosystem in which it's interlocked, it then just becomes pure substance. And it's a terrifying kind of substance because we get it not en masse, but we get it in 1 boatload, 2 boatload, 3 boatload. So in a way, it can be moved in a way that's very, very furtive, very hard to track, and loses very quickly that history, which is so important in its point of origin. And so I think this film really shows, in the Cambodian case, how devastating that economy really, really is. Yeah.
I mean, the movie is really it's heartbreaking. In fact, it's quite it's a very powerful film that shows so much in such a short time. Yeah, well, thank you very much. I would just like to perhaps go back to Faiq, because I think that you're again kind of revolving around these ideas of materialities, but this touches upon questions of ecology and also questions of lost lands, in fact, and the kind of this. There is also a student in my seminar who is looking at the kind of displacements of mass. And how that actually is, of course, a kind of quantifiable entity. So we can look at this from this point of view. But I was wondering if there is something to say about how these questions of materialities overlap with, as you said, question of ecology, but also, which is addressed a little bit here, about indigeneity and land claim. So I would like to ask perhaps Faiq if he could explore a little bit this in relation to Joshua's work, if that's possible, Faiq.
Yeah, I mean, sure. As you were talking, I have been thinking of a somewhat related. I hope it will intersect with your question, and a related point, which is about my context about Palestine and about the definition of these islands, or the definition of lands politically and from a security perspective. Now, for example, if we go to the archipelago slide that Joshua has presented, and we see the different designations of land in the West Bank into areas A, B, and C. And each of them has a different sort of legal and security apparatus in place. And to go back to materiality, in this specific case, for example, the cases of areas B and C, they become spaces of extraction because of their designation itself, because they fall beyond the islands that are areas A that are under not full, but let's say considerable Palestinian control. Areas that are still considered part of Palestine, but beyond this partial sovereignty of the Palestinians, become places or spaces of extraction because of the indeterminacy or because of the proliferation of laws that apply to them. So they become places where, for example, Israel can grant extraction licenses for certain companies, multinational or Israeli companies, while denying it to others. In Area B, for example, spaces that are very close to the habitation zones of Palestinians become stone extraction sites, particularly because the Palestinian law does not exactly apply there, but Israel does not want to either apply its own environmental law. So there you find stone extraction sites right next to houses, which are threatening the health and threatening the environment of the place and its inhabitants. And to me, again, this relates to how the political and security definition of these islands and bounded spaces creates these gray zones in which such extractive activities can happen, seemingly beyond the reach of law, but in reality in the neglect of law, or in the neglect of the sovereign who chooses not to apply or to apply certain laws that serves its own purpose. Now, I don't know, Charlotte, how much that relates to your question specifically, but this was what I was thinking of when you asked this, but we can also take this conversation further.
No, of course it relates. I think this question of how extraction comes into play in relation to these extraterritorialities and also exceptions in the state of law, I think is of course related, but I would leave Joshua to actually answer to your question and to your point.
If it's okay, if I could add something very very much related that resonated with me. I mean, the question of, you described islands, of course, as a power technology, right? So the kind of spaces of extreme concentration of power. But however, we speak about, let's say, extraction in the Philippines, right? So we speak again about the kind of center-peripheral relationships, or we speak about the kind of island versus something which is perhaps outside or under different kind of rule regime. So I'm curious about the kind of power geography that we see emerging, right? So literally, if we would to say so, begin to draw a map of that, would that be possible, right? And would there be spaces that are to say so hinterlands that are always suspended between multiple, power centers, or to say so drawn within a kind of different power constellations. I mean, what do we see in terms of center-periphery relations, and what do we see in terms of the kind of possible strategies of empowerment, right? within this relation. I mean, this ties back to the kind of indigenous and questions and so on.
Yeah, and I think Milica, I think this is a very important question, because, for example, the map of the West Bank, which I think is a very important document, shows the power just initially of starting to kind of represent the presence of these islands and the presence of them territorially. So, for example, so I'm Jewish. I come from a Jewish family. I get in arguments about Israel-Palestine with people so often, and very often a kind of standard piece of argumentation is brought up, which is the Palestinians were offered this piece of territory, right? Imagined as a kind of large extent, which is the West Bank, and they refused it, right? And this is an argument that's made to kind of put either both sides of the argument, or kind of put culpability on the Palestinians for the failure of talks, right? And in fact, most people have never seen this particular drawing of the West Bank that shows how compartmentalized it is, shows how many different territorial fragments there are, shows, as Faiq was saying, all of these extensive kind of spaces of extraction that exist between them, right? So there's a moment in which even kind of beginning to draw the underlying kind of territorial reality in a very pragmatic way of just saying driving a car from A to B within that territorial space is something that I think, suddenly kind of reframes questions of territory. I mean, we still tend to, I think, draw in this kind of Westphalian statism. It's like the old map we had in school where, states had a kind of given boundary and were infilled with a common color, and we kind of assume that they're all made of the same stuff, right? There's a kind of a climate of kind of equality, at least legally and territorially within them, right? So to me, I think the drawing of these and the drawing of their relations in terms of kind of centers and peripheries of kind of settlements and outposts, the whole way in which they're related is a kind of a new cartographic language that I think would be, really, really interesting to explore. Just a little bit going back quickly to Charlotte's question, if I may, just one of the things that sprung to mind about the question of materiality and indigeneity. If you're interested in that, a really interesting person to read is my colleague and friend Nadia Abou-El-Hajj, who's in Colombia, who studies Israeli archaeology and the attempt to find indigeneity in the soil through precedents, right? Through a kind of national archaeological project of what they call facts on the ground, which is to basically say, look how long we have been here. Here's archaeological evidence of the primacy of Jewish occupation. And that is very interesting because it's a space where all forms of strange materiality, archaeological practices, modes of scientific classification and taxonomy come up against a very kind of hard kernel of establishment of indigenous rights and what those mean, right? The framing of just sort of like having been there first, having bones in the ground, DNA in the ground is seen as a kind of a form of ownership of territory in a very kind of Manichaean or binary kind of sense. And a lot of those sites, by the way, are happening between those islands that we see, right? They're often kind of set aside as spaces of kind of national importance and heritage interest. And then they are kind of moved into a category for forms of, I would say, ethnic national exploration and science.
Great, thank you. No, I think that also it's interesting to point at the fact that that sand in itself or a soil is anyway a kind of library of other things, and I mean this was also part of other conversation at the chair, and also an interest of Milica on how soil actually carries all this information. Perhaps this is a good moment to open up a little bit to our audience. I think Maria has a question. Maria Barovic.
Yes. First, thank you for interesting lecture. It was inspiring to hear of an island, especially after we have had an opportunity to read and discuss your work. My question is about illegality and maybe follows up this notion of power relations. In our class discussions, we often come to the issues of illegality, illegal extraction, illegal market, labor, and so on. So I was interested in what you have described as contradictions of liberal society that allows for abuses of law, abuses under the law, but within particular defined spatial conditions, as in the example of an island. And also you talked about these power relations in the sense of contemporary biopolitics. So I would be interested to hear more about the concept of contemporary biopolitics and what is the role of space in relation to this? How important is the space in creating of illegality when it comes to neoliberalism? And also secondly, you have showed many different examples of island ranging in scale from a single building over a city to infrastructure network. So does scale affect conditions that will emerge within this island phenomenon?
Oh yeah, those are excellent questions. Both kind of, I think, very complex questions. And I think what's interesting about the questions of islands and illegality is the kind of mythology of that question versus the, in a way, the reality of how they've operated. So when, the actual functioning of these, as I was mentioning before, of kind of island prisons is very interesting, because very often, as I said with Guantanamo Bay, there's this idea that once you make a spatial demarcation for something, you can put it there, right? This idea that you could take terror, as vaguely defined as that concept was, in that period of time, and you can place terror somewhere, right? Outside of the American national space, but you can kind of, in a way, exorcise it to a location and keep it there, right? Had to do with a notion of a kind of very instrumental relationship between law and law enforcement and space, right? That we can create spaces for illegality, and we can create spaces where we ourselves retain a certain form of kind of purity, right? Of moral purity. But in fact, as we know, a lot of what is happening when those sites are created is sites which are effectively spaces of exception, right? They work in the same logic as things like concentration camps, any form of, of kind of national exceptionalism, where the rules of a given kind of state do not anymore kind of apply. So there's an interesting way where at least in the kind of concepts of the legal, there's an idea that an anomalous zone is a place where you can really do what you need to do to fight illegality, or to fight evil, or to fight, contrary kind of political ideological interests and so on. And this happened also, it happened in World War II with the internment of Japanese. It happened, during the kind of anti-communist years in the US as well. So there is this kind of idea. And what we see often again and again and again, going back to Faiq's point with the kind of the settler mentality, was the idea that you could defend a perimeter with an island, and you could also rid something that you wanted to exile to an island. And those two ideas kind of worked in a kind of interesting kind of contrast or contradiction with each other. Your question about biopolitics is fascinating. Okay, so I don't work on the kind of spatialization of biopolitics in the US. I work mainly in Singapore, which is an immensely biopolitical state. It's a state that is associated with kind of not just corporeal punishment, right, famously with kind of caning, but also with all kinds of modes of kind of regulating. It's one of the few countries where, for example, they try to find single people with very good college degrees and academic records, and to actually matchmake them to make a kind of a more eugenically perfect kind of future of Singapore, right? There was something called the Romancing Singapore campaign, which you have this anxiety about having a low birth rate, where the government actually contracted someone to make a perfume and a cologne so that Singaporeans would be more kind of physically attracted to each other and make more babies, right? So there is this kind of intensity. And here, the way it plays out in my own research, and I don't want to speak to the US because I don't really fully have a kind of grasp on that, or to Europe, but In Singapore, there is very much an attempt to kind of make correlations between forms of the nation and forms of the domestic and the personal. So for example, in Singapore's famous public housing, or HDBs, when the block is created and it's sold, it has the same demographic mixture racially as the overall nation, for example. So there's an attempt metonymically to kind of replicate a kind of idealized Singapore with a series of very abbreviated ethnic racial categories like Chinese, Malay, Indian, other, right? And what it does is effectively replicate that, right? So there's a whole kind of sense in which there's an ideal kind of biopolitical typology, which is then kind of replicated, and it's maintained in various ways through kind of housing, through racial, characteristics and naming, and it's changing all the time, right? So I have 3 kids. They all are technically 3 different races in Singapore because the racial characteristics changed in the birth certificate registration between the first, the second, and the third. So there's a very intense kind of manipulation of that. But in Singapore, at least it's very spatialized. It tends to be spatialized through a politics of housing and through a differentiation between what's seen as private and public space, in short. But it's a massive and fascinating question.
Thank you, Joshua. Yeah, I mean, it's also part of the electoral map, right? The kind of placing of certain populations so that they would vote according to certain ideas, right? So it even extends to...
Absolutely. And this goes back to Faiq's question about the historicity of all of this, right? Is that obsession that the PAP has with what they call ethnic enclaving. That is a term that they picked up from the SIT, from the British during the colonial years, who were worried about inter-ethnic violence in the kampongs. So basically there is a kind of a continuity between a historical desire to spatialize race and a kind of a contemporary desire to kind of model and idealize racial balance, and then to kind of replicate that both laterally, horizontally and vertically and 3-dimensionally effectively.
Fascinating biopolitics of Singapore. We could talk nonstop about this for another hour. But there is Milica maybe, and then Sarah also raised her hand. So
yeah, exactly. It's a question by Sarah. I was wondering if you saw it. Hi, Sarah.
Hi. Thank you, Joshua, for your really interesting lecture. I had a question. I was curious also on the notion of historicity. During your lecture, I didn't see a reference of the Caribbean. And I was curious about that also because much of what you've discussed, actually, all of it happened or occurred in the colonial history of the Caribbean, also as the island as a isolating object, like the Devil's Island that you mentioned before, but also in relation between the islands and the relation between the island and the mainland. For instance, Barbados at one point was completely deforested, and so Suriname had to have these wooden plantations that would now have to supply the other islands of wood for the settlements. And I was curious, so it's in a way sort of the birthplace of, you could argue, of modern capitalism at one particular scale, that now we have it on the global scale. And so I was curious, how come you avoided that particular reference? Simply, and also, what is your opinion about, I'm not an expert on Glissant's theory, but his archipelagic thinking and this notion of the island in relation to the world.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with very much of what he has to say. And I think that in a way, that's why I'm arguing that actually it's the archipelagic relationship that is really kind of the critical one. It's the new geopolitical relationship. And it is, if we go back initially to kind of the first thing that Milica said, in a way, it is both the kind of the alarming and the hopeful kind of side of the story of kind of islanding or kind of a geopolitics of isolation, is the idea of, I almost wore a t-shirt with a quote from his that says, "Thinking like an archipelago," which is one of my favorite quotes. And I really feel that this is kind of one of the major kind of sources of theoretical kind of tools to think about this. About the Caribbean, no, it's not an intentional avoidance. In fact, I think that what we see in many of these cases is the kind of the birthplace of a kind of spatial language also of modern capitalism, but also of both colonialism and anti-colonialism. So, I mean, in my course here, I teach modern social thought, and we begin with, effectively, we talk about race beginning with the Haitian Revolution, right? And the way in which this was suddenly seen to be the kind of something that needed to be contained on its own island, right? The kind of colonial reaction to this was about encircling and containing, as if in a way you could contain the idea, you know, of liberation by kind of surrounding something with warships, you know. And so there's a very, very interesting history there, and it also goes to the kind of the complexity of, you know, the North Atlantic trade and the triangle trade and all of different kinds of ways in which the islands were kind of played against each other and kind of kept separate. And also today, and I think this speaks to your point, is that just the kind of the sheer complexity. I mean, the fact that Guantanamo exists in the way that it does, and the fact that Puerto Rico has the kind of like ambiguous kind of lack of representation politically that it does and lack of sovereignty, I mean, comes from kind of still that history, which I think in many ways is kind of still working itself out. Yeah, it's kind of where a lot of this began, but in a way, a lot of it is still really happening, you know.
Thanks, Joshua. Just, I think we will like to wrap up quite soon. I think Elsa has a question, and then Faiq would perhaps take the closing remarks. Milica, maybe you would also like to then perhaps conclude. But so, Elsa.
Hi, thank you, Joshua, for the talk. It was very inspiring, as Maria said. I think one of the things that resonate for me during your talk was all these islands that are kind of out of the legal entities, that kind of a buffer. So I wanted to ask about what's the position that we should take, like even the citizens that live there and the people who arrive, like all these buffered islands, like Nauru Island, or like some island in Europe where refugees come and stay for a while, but these are not their final destination. Like even the Mexican border, that sometimes is just like a buffer place that it's isolated from from everything, from everywhere else. And how should we approach that?
It's, you know, it's an incredibly complex question. I think in my mind, one of the first ways is really about the politics of visibility. I mean, as you know, when you began your question, these islands that kind of slip out of the, you know, consciousness, right? And there, in a sense, there is this very narrow spotlight, which tends to miss islands. And, you know, the only thing that is positive that I think that's come out of just the humanitarian disaster of these enormous waves of migration that we've had in the last 2 decades is that these islands have become visible. Like, you know, a lot of people didn't understand how Australia was manipulating its, you know, anti-immigration policy through the use of islands, for example. People did not know, you know, the history of that region also when it came to, you know, the whole kind of series of islands that have been contested and been in various states of kind of civil war. We didn't, you know, we just didn't know these things. And you know, or most of us didn't. The people who had to go there had, you know, knew about it, but the general public were kind of, it was out of sight and out of mind. So I mean, I think one of the things that needs to be kind of considered is a kind of a politics of the island, of you know, in a way, kind of engaging with these spaces, of forcing their renationalization, forcing against forms of kind of legal exceptionalism, you know, making them really responsible as kind of parts of a kind of a generalized national fabric. I mean, while I do believe that there's a kind of utopian potential on islands, I do worry that there is just a sheer fragmentation that happens where we cannot be looking in so many places at once, and which means that there's a likelihood that there's always an island that we haven't seen where something horrible is taking place. So the kind of the reabsorption of these into some form of homogenized national space that's at least under a form of law that doesn't have exceptions of this kind, at least spatial exceptions, I think is very, very important. I mean, what's amazing about Guantanamo is that they created such a legal mess there intentionally that they can't close it. I mean, this was like the story of Barack Obama trying to close Guantanamo. They just couldn't do it because it had been performed into so many you know, forms of contradiction. So I think it's the kind of the unworking of that, but also kind of becoming very aware of the kind of colonial history of islands as a technology in the first place, so that we can kind of call these really, really what they are and strip them of this kind of fake language about kind of refugee camps, and we can kind of call it what it is. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you very much, Joshua. It was a very good answer.
Thank you, Joshua. So maybe Faiq, you want to take the last question or comment?
Yeah, actually, the last question ties into what I was gonna say. I mean, for me, Joshua's axioms and the presentation was really powerful for different reasons. One of them is like the gestural aspect of it, and like the paradigm of the island as a paradigm through which to read many spaces we are in right now, but also the analytical aspect of it, which, of course, to me, from so far is a question, is an open question, but it's a very powerful one as well. And I wanted also to end on the utopian, or on the possibilities of the current moment. And I think that, for example, in the work of the chair and the work of Milica's chair on commodity chains and global capital and so on, there is an aspect of challenging our imaginaries and our paradigms of what a territory is, what a bounded sovereign space is, and etc. And it makes us read the current political moment and global capitalism more for what they actually are materially. And I think this is also the potential of Joshua, what you have presented. But at the same time, I am wondering about also the island, both as an imaginary of the state, or the settler colonial state, as we have said, but also as a reality, and also in the imaginary or in the goals of people who are on the losing end of the equation right now. I know that, for example, Palestinians, even though they are living this archipelago reality, are surely not thinking of it as the future they hope to be living in, for example. But at the same time, it is the reality. And to go back, maybe I think Milica touched upon this, or asked this at the very beginning of the discussion today, of, okay, like this is the current state of capital that we are living in. This is the current political form that we are living in as well. What are the possibilities within that? And to go back to the notion of utopia that you have mentioned, and also because you have referenced Engels many times here, I'm wondering of the possibilities of the concrete utopia, maybe that this reality opens up. The utopia that we might imagine through the possibilities of what is currently available, or what is currently in place. Are there any redemptive qualities to it? Are there any possibilities that we can look at? So, I mean, for me, this is, of course, an open question. And again, maybe like you, Joshua, I don't want to force a kind of utopian reading, or a kind of optimistic reading of this island situation. But at the same time, I'm wondering what possibilities might lie there for us.
Yeah, and I think you raise, I mean, it's in a way the question to end on. It's the perfect question to end on. And I think one of the things that I didn't mention, because I'm talking in a way about very mainstream kind of formative kind of Western colonial history, ideas of utopia. There is also, by the way, a whole history of utopias, some islands, some not, many bounded territories that were not the utopias of the white colonial mainstream, right? They're the utopias of people of color. There's a beautiful book that just came out. I forgot the name of the author, but I'll send it to you subsequently, about the history of Black utopian thought and the actual attempts among African Americans to build ideal communities that were that had various different kinds of fates, but many of which existed for periods of time. So there's a whole history also of kind of utopianism that doesn't have quite the same kind of authoritarian kind of valence that many of the kind of formal utopias we have. It's like what Dick Hebdige said, that in the West, all of our utopias come wrapped in barbed wire, right? This is the prisons and utopias are kind of two sides of not even really two sides of the same coin. But there is, of course, a whole history of kind of counter utopias, alternative utopias, right? And a kind of a desire, in spite of the constraints of certain kinds of islands, to commit to a politics of hope that has forms of materialization about it. So I remember a really interesting talk I heard A.L. Weitzman gave like years ago in the very, very early days of the forensic architecture program, where he was basically looking at strategies and counter strategies that the Israelis and the Palestinians used to try and build and unbuild architecture, right? As the kind of the various forms of encampments are becoming formalized, what happens is that, you know, the bulldozers come by and they kind of start to knock the columns away so that the concrete buildings kind of start to become tent-like, right? They start to fail and they take on the forms of something that looks like failure or looks like impermanence. And then the contractors go back and they rebuild it and they rebuild it and they rebuild it. And there's a kind of a sense in which there's a kind of an unbroken determination to build that island. And then with the intention eventually of a kind of a connectivity. And that's, you know, that's where we get into Marxian territory, right? That idea that our connected consciousness as a group of people who are in a sense isolated or islanded will eventually form into a mode of collective consciousness that allows us a kind of a permanence. So for me, I always use Gramsci's phrase, which is pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will, right? It's this idea that just like these guys that go back the next day and keep rebuilding this thing and rebuilding this thing, that there are potentialities there too, right? It's not always a case of exclusion, authoritarianism, or kind of extraction or exception. Yeah.
Thank you, Joshua, for this concluding remark. I think to end on Gramsci is always a great sign for a successful talk. Yeah. Milica, do you want to perhaps conclude?
Yeah, maybe
set everybody free.
Yeah, sure. I mean, so many things to say, and it was I think really a perfect start of this series on material accumulations. I mean, by pointing out to the immaterial and by pointing out to the kind of geographies in which these let's say material flows or trajectories or exchanges are unfolding, right? So we are not talking about the spaces of the nation state. We are talking about the much more complex political or power geographies that are based on this idea of the island. That island itself has to do with power, and therefore it has to do with also power to accumulate and to attract, let's say, you know, resources or capital, and in that sense it ties very much into the kind of problematic of, let's say, material cultures, material realities, and so on. And I was attracted. I mean, there are so many themes that were opened up, but a curiosity, I mean, the notion of visibility and, you know, what is legal, what is illegal, and how islands as a tool or as technology negotiates these kind of territories of, you know, possible and impossible and exception and so on, is fascinating. And I remember that the archipelago in the vicinity of Singapore, right? If you look at the Riau archipelago, we counted there are 4,200 something islands, and only about 1,000 of them are actually named. And all the others that are unnamed are also those that, you know, where the action cannot be, you know, accountable or traced or you know, so it is literally a kind of a space that is invisible, right? So it is not that is uninhabited, it is not the wild, not at all. It is simply the kind of a gray area where, you know, where something is happening. And I think that this is a very interesting metaphor for much broader geographies of, let's say, contemporary capitalism and of material flows, right? I mean, and I think that kind of being able to look beyond into and, you know, basically illuminate some of those relationships is really important. And I think that also this discussion whether, you know, whether island let's say model is ultimately, you know, utopian or dystopian. It's a fantastic discussion because I think we are, we see, globally the kind of, in a way, I would say both on the left and the right, somehow island is emerging as a potent kind of political metaphor or a tool, right? And you described it also, Josh, in the beginning. And I also feel that or see that there is this even the kind of a certain ecological or environmental attraction or social. I mean, the notion of difference. Island is something that helps, perhaps create difference, right? So in a kind of a, let's say, a world of kind of universalizing, I don't know, totalitarian, ideologies. I mean, this is perhaps a positive development, but indeed, I mean, how to pursue the kind of local politics at the while to say so, also keeping the kind of a planetary scale, relevant, which I think is something we have to effectively. So I think this is perhaps a very, very interesting question politically. So I'm really excited to have had this session, and thank you all really very much. Thanks, Faiq, for the great discussion. Thanks, Joshua, for the amazing lecture. I'm really, it was really kind of a stroke of, I think, interesting idea to bring you two together. Not obvious, but I think it worked really well. So we were very proud of this idea. Thank you for that. And thanks everybody for joining. I hope you will be here with us, and a warm welcome in 2 weeks from now for the session Carola Hein discussing with Nirai Bhatia on petroleumscapes, and I think that will remain very much in the kind of material dichotomy. Thank you so much for being here.